everybody, and welcome to Getting the Work Done, Continuous Communication and the Role of the Backbone. This is webinar number 4 in the Collective Impact webinar series for Engaging Underrepresented Youth. Engaging Underrepresented Youth, the Collective Impact webinar series, is sponsored by Employment and Social Development Canada, the Learning Branch, and the Tamarack Institute. I'm Liz Weaver. I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and I'd like to begin by introducing you to the Tamarack Institute. The Tamarack Institute is composed of 2 parts. We have our Tamarack Learning Center, which is really focused on change makers like yourselves. We've identified 5 interconnected practices which we believe lead to impactful community change, and they are collective impact. This webinar series falls within the collective impact area of practice. But we also support community engagement, collaborative leadership, community innovation, and evaluating impact. The other part of Tamarack is working with community leaders in driving forward change in their cities and neighborhoods. And this work is called Vibrant Communities. And we work with cities and neighborhoods in cities reducing poverty and cities deepening community. To learn more about Tamarack, visit www.tamarackcommunity.ca. We have some goals for this webinar. The first goal is to review with you the Collective Impact Framework. This sets the context for the focus of this webinar, which is to learn more about the condition of continuous communications and backbone infrastructure. And then finally, we will introduce you to some tools that will help you maximize your continuous communication and backbone infrastructure work. Collective impact, what is it? Well, the folks at FSG and the Collective Impact Forum define collective impact as a disciplined cross-sector approach solving complex social and environmental issues at scale. So there's some things to consider here. Cross-sector means that we are going to bring people with different perspectives and different ideas to the table, to our leadership table when we're working collectively together. And these complex issues, the idea of engaging underrepresented youth is a complex issue. We know that the journey for each underrepresented youth is unique, and so that's what makes this issue complex. The Collective Impact Framework has 3 preconditions and 5 core conditions. The preconditions of collective impact are influential champions. So that's really thinking about who are the champions that we want to bring around our table, and what's the sphere of influence that they have that they might be able to help us kind of leverage for this shared or collective work. The second precondition is around urgency of the issue. And so is this issue that we want to move the needle on, is it urgent and important? And if we think about the issue of underrepresented youth, to what degree will that have lifelong impacts for those youth and their families when they are not represented in education, in employment, or even in post-secondary education and training? And then finally, adequate resources. Do we have both human and financial resources to be able to do this work over a longer period of time, say the next 3 to 4 years? The core conditions of collective impact are framing a common agenda. So this really says that this is our shared vision for change, and it includes both a common understanding of the problem, but also the strategies that we're going to undertake collectively to move the needle on the problem. Shared measurement is about really measuring our results consistently. So that means that we have to be informed by data. What do we know about this problem? What's the data tell us? But then measure our progress as we go. Mutually reinforcing activities is to leverage the existing resources that we already have in our community in a way that helps us achieve our common agenda and helps us move the measurement forward. And then the final 2 conditions of collective impact, and the ones that we're going to focus on in this webinar, are continuous communications and backbone support. Continuous communications is really important in a collective impact framework because we're bringing folks that may not necessarily have worked together effectively in the past or have ever worked together at all. We're bringing them around the table and asking them to really achieve something different for our community. And so we need to really think about trust building and transparency and communications. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then backbone support, or backbone infrastructure, as it's often called, is really a small group of staffing support that might help this collective impact work advance, and also those that we are engaging in our leadership table or around our leadership table. We've done other webinars in this series on a common agenda. That's webinar number 1. Shared measurement is webinar number 2. Mutually reinforcing activities is webinar number 3. And this is the 4th and final in this webinar series. We invite you to access the other webinars by visiting the Tamarack website, www.tamarackcommunity.ca. So continuous communications, we'll start with that condition of collective impact. What do we mean by continuous communications? Well, this means that we are creating formal and informal processes to keep people that are sitting around our leadership table, our working groups, or engaged with our work in some way, to keep them informed and engaged in the work. We recognize that this needs to be open, and that it really needs to have and reflect a diversity of communication styles and practices. Sometimes we can use social media to communicate our messages. Sometimes we might need to build a website. Other times we might need to send emails. So you really want to think about, who needs what information and how might we communicate that information to them. And then the final kind of idea behind continuous communication is that difficult issues are surfaced. So sometimes when you're bringing folks who may not have worked together before, or there might be a history of them working together in the past, there might be issues that you have to surface. And so you want to be able to figure that out and then to have them discussed and addressed. In our first webinar on developing a common agenda, we talked about values and principles for working together. Well, when we're surfacing different and difficult issues, you want to bring forward those values and principles that you've already agreed to, because they can be very helpful in terms of these more challenging conversations. So collective impact, the framework has 8 principles of practice. And so this is helpful, and these were developed by the Collective Impact Forum. They're helpful to kind of understand how collective impact works as a framework, but also what are some principles that we could build into our own ways of working together and our ways of communicating. And so these principles of practice reflect a wide range of things, like including community members as part of the collaborative, recruiting and co-creating with cross-sector partners, building a culture that fosters relationships, trust, and respect across participants, and then cultivating leaders with unique system leadership skills. So as you look through these principles of practice, you can see how they can really help in terms of thinking about how these principles of practice might relate to continuous communication and effective strategies for implementing continuous communication. At Tamarack, we often think about communication, particularly from a collective perspective, by asking these questions. Who needs what information? How do we package it? And what do we hope that they will do with that information? So who needs what information, packaged how, for what purpose? If you're thinking about, we need to send out this report about our collective impact work, you want to think about, okay, so who needs to get that report? Well, our leadership table does. Underrepresented youth need to get it. How would we package it? Well, our leadership table is really busy, so they don't really want to read lengthy reports. They want to read one-page summary. So we might package it as a one-page summary. And for what purpose? Well, we want them to make a decision, or we want to use this tool to engage youth. So you really want to take a piece of communication and spend some time considering, what do they need? What kind of information? How are we going to package it? And then what do we hope they will do with it? And the more purposeful you can be in your communication approach, the more successful and the more impactful you will be in terms of your communication results. The next condition that we want to focus on is the role of backbone infrastructure. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different collective impact initiatives across Canada, the US, and internationally. And there are many different forms and structures of collective impact backbones. But the most common structure is a combination of volunteer leaders, so that's your leadership table, and a small paid staff team that's working collectively. So the leadership table and the staff team are working together to achieve the community outcomes. They almost work as a single unit as opposed to separate units. Now we know that the volunteer leadership team has a little bit less time on their hands, but they should work in concert, small paid staff team, because the volunteer leadership team brings a lot of great connections, a lot of great resources, and they almost are the first adopters or the early adopters of the change that you're trying to move forward in your community. So what are some characteristics of backbone leaders? This comes from a survey that the folks at the FSG and the Collective Impact Forum did with some backbone leaders in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. And these were the characteristics that they found of the leaders in those communities. They're visionary, so they have a big picture vision, and yet they're results oriented, that they have the ability to be collaborative, and they like to build relationships, right? And so that's why if you think about the backbone as this combination of staff and leadership table, then you actually can build more relationships with that combination. They're focused and adaptive. They have charismatic and influential communication skills. They understand what's going on from a political perspective, and they have some savvy in that way. And they don't need all the credit. There's a humility or a humbleness to their work. These individuals are big picture. They have a big picture perspective, and they understand how to bring all the pieces together. They have energy to drive this work of community change forward, and that they're also passionate. And this set of characteristics, these leadership characteristics, are hard to find in one person. So it's also better if we think about these as, what we need for our backbone infrastructure, whether it's around our backbone staff team or around our backbone leadership table. So some of the backbone roles are to guide the overall vision and strategy of the collective impact work. They're the ones that say, we're going to make sure that all the strategies, all the vision, that it's all trying to move us to better outcomes for our community. They support aligned activities. They establish shared measurement and learning practices and bring folks to the table around those. They build public will through a whole variety of community engagement sessions. They advance policy change, and in some cases, backbones will mobilize funding, either not generally for themselves, but more to support the work of community change that's happening in the broader community. There are some common misperceptions about backbones, and these are that the backbone sets the agenda for all of the work that is to be done. In fact, it's community-based work, right? And so, a way of counterbalancing this kind of misperception of backbones is to think about this work is about community change, and it's about collective and collaborative work. And so you really want to think about not a single organization or a single individual leading this work, but how collectively we can work on it together. So some essential governance documents when thinking about backbone infrastructure is to consider the big picture. So to really think about the common agenda and the strategies, the principles of working together, and the framework for change. In some cases, you might want to put into place some technical agreements, a memorandum of understanding with the fiscal host, the organization that is receiving money on behalf of the backbone infrastructure, and the other partners that are around the table. You might want to have terms of reference for the leadership table. You probably want to have some conflict resolution mechanisms put into place. And then finally, you want to think about, who do we want to have as members? around our leadership table. What's the decision-making process we're going to undertake? Is it consensus? Is it, majority vote? Can we do when we have to make decisions? How do we allocate funding? What are some of the things we want to put into place around communication and reporting? What are some of our policies and procedures? And then finally, how do we engage in terms of innovation and learning processes? Resourcing collective impact initiatives is really an important role that the backbone has to consider. There are a variety of inputs that you can access, and here's a list of some of the common inputs from a resource perspective that some collective impact communities have leveraged. But it's also about thinking about the reallocation of existing resources. It might be about secondments from other organizations. It might be about repurposed staffing, in-kind contributions, associations at work, and it could also be about the contributions of citizens in terms of their volunteer time and their volunteer leadership. So really think about collective impact as, this big umbrella of resources that you can have access to, and you're only as big as your imagination. In different communities, you would have different elements that would come into play in terms of resourcing. So you might not necessarily have a United Way in your community or a community foundation, and so those wouldn't necessarily fit on your list, but you could get in-kind contributions, and you could have citizens who are volunteering their time and resources, or you might have local businesses that are willing to invest. So really look at this list as the kind of big scope, and then really think about it in the context of your community. So here are some tools for you to consider for continuous communication. One of the tools that we use a lot is called a plan on a page. And this is when you have landed on your common agenda and your theory of change or your core strategies. You want to build it in a way that it is one plan on one page. You don't need a big long plan with multiple papers and multiple research pieces. You really want to build something that is accessible and compelling. And so here are some elements that you might put into the header and footer of the plan on a page, and also some things that you might include as kind of the core sections of your plan on a page. We've got some examples of plans on a page in the link that you have on this slide in this PowerPoint. So you might want to go to the building a plan on a page and see the examples that we've provided. This has been a really useful tool for lots of collective impact initiatives. Another thing to think about is a strategy map. And so a collective impact strategy map provides partners with a timeline and the key outcomes that you want to achieve along the way. It's something that you can bring forward to each of your partner meetings, and you can adjust as you go. It helps to show movement and progress in a very tangible way for your partners. Here's an example of a collective impact strategy map. This was a collective impact initiative in Indiana. So they launched a team, they built their framework, they refined their framework, they shared it with top 100 business leaders in their community. They began to do some action planning on their strategies, and then they moved towards implementation. And every time that group met, they would bring this strategy map forward, and they would say, okay, so we're working on building our collective impact framework. Our next stage is to refine our framework. Are we all still together in this work? So it can be a really helpful tool, particularly in the early phases of your collective impact work. So plan on a page and strategy maps are two really useful tools. A final communications tool that you might consider is to develop as you go a key milestone report. And a key milestone report is a living document that captures kind of the core decisions that are made. It's regularly updated, and it can be used both as a marketing tool and also as an orientation tool. Again, we recommend that it's a shorter tool, 2 to 3 pages max. Sometimes it can be even shorter than that if you're very new in your process, but it actually becomes a really core document for your communication strategy. So now we're going to look at some tools for backbone infrastructure. And the first tool is to establish principles for working together collectively. And so we have a resource that we've developed at Tamarack around these values and principles. We talked already in this slide about the 8 principles of practice that the Collective Impact Forum has identified for collective impact. Here's another way that you can look at them. So you might say, we will work from an equity lens, or we will focus on inclusion. So this list of principles or list of kind of principle areas might be ones that you want to embed into your the core principles for working collectively together. Another thing that is useful, particularly when you think about backbone infrastructure, is to kind of think about a governance structure. So this comes from some work by Tanya Sermon and Mark Sermon from the Center for Social Innovation in Canada. And they have identified this collaborative governance model called the Constellation Model of Governance. And so on the one side, under strategic guidance and support, is your leadership table or your steering committee and your backbone infrastructure. So you can see that on the one side. And then on the other side is really the ecosystem of community partners. So these are partners that might be involved in strategy, or they might be doing stuff in the community that are part of that kind of bigger ecosystem. And while they might not be directly involved in strategy at the moment, you still want to know that they're out there and that there might be opportunities in the future to engage them. What I like about this governance structure is that it is horizontal rather than vertical. And it says, you know, we're all working on this common agenda together and we're all engaged in the work. And you can see that the lines go back and forth, right? And so both groups should be informing each other of the work. And often the chairs of the working group are often sitting around the table of the steering committee. So there's this nice kind of mix of communication and shared work back and forth. So that's the end of our webinar on continuous communication and backbone infrastructure. If you want to access more collective impact resources, please visit www.tamarackcommunity.ca. We also invite you to listen to the other webinars in this webinar series on collective impact. The first one being developing and scoping your common agenda. The second webinar is establishing shared measurement. The third webinar looks at mutually reinforcing activity. And feel free to listen to this webinar again on continuous communication and mutually reinforcing activity. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm Liz Weaver, and I can be reached at liz@tamarackcommunity.ca. Thank you for joining us on the Engaging Underrepresented Youth Collective Impact webinar series. This webinar is sponsored by Employment and Social Development Canada, the Learning Branch, and by the Tamarack Institute.